How is everyone today? I've been told this is a heat wave in New Hampshire. 89. I just came from Charleston, South Carolina, where it's 97 degrees and it's just June. There's just nothing special about it. That was very kind what Eric said. He's said many kind things about me over the years. And our journey together. When did we first meet? At New York, Ron Paul headquarters in like 2011? Webster Hall, which used to be the Ritz. I got to introduce Ron Paul during the 2012 campaign. I worked for it at Webster Hall. It was packed. I thought it was so cool that, this Republican presidential candidate had a packed house in deep blue New York. But I was also thinking, I'm also a musician, this is the old Ritz where Guns N' Roses played, and it was on MTV in the late 80s, and the Rolling Stones played on this stage, and Ron Paul, so you can't beat that. Actually, some of what Eric said is what I wanted to get into today. The title is The Liberty Movement in 2024. I just turned 50. I've been involved in this movement since Ron Paul 2007, 2008. You guys preceded me with what you're doing with the Free State Project, but I think it all ties together, and I think sometimes we tend to be pessimistic about things. When you look at things on a larger scope, a larger scale, we should be more optimistic. My personality is optimistic. My friends make fun of me for that, but I can usually defend why I'm that way, and I'm going to today. My own political trajectory, and it relates to why we're all here and what we all believe in some sort of loose, tangential way. I was living in Woburn, Massachusetts from about 93 to 96. I know from my accent you can tell I'm from the area. But I was a Southern guy. I moved up there to play in a band. I knew some people. It just made sense at the time. We didn't do very much musically. But I began to get interested in politics. I was a teenager about to turn 20. I liked Rush Limbaugh. My favorite talk host to this day was the late David Brudnoy. Do any of you remember him? On WBC, I love that guy. I've never heard anybody better. He was a libertarian. I was not. I was a guy who liked Rush Limbaugh and things conservative. So I was in the Barnes & Noble, I think it was in Stoneham, and I see a book called The Conservative Mind. I'm like, man, this book must be about how crappy Bill Clinton is. He's terrible. That was the era, right? It was by a man named Russell Kirk, who did not like libertarians. He and Frank Meyer at early National Review would tussle. Frank Meyer being, of course, the godfather of fusionism, which was virtue and liberty tied together, and the history of American conservatism. But what that book did is it opened me up to intellectual conservatism, thinking about things beyond partisan politics and how bad Bill Clinton sucked, as Rush Limbaugh told me every day, as did the David Brudnoy show, honest. He had a smart show. But I did learn quickly that Russell Kirk was anti-war. Well, around that same time, a guy named Pat Buchanan was running for president, and he won the primary in this state in 1996. And that guy was anti-war. He was preaching against the Persian Gulf War at the time, and I was like, that's for me. That's my guy. I knew he wasn't going to win, but most of our candidates never win, right? That's where we were. So I was an anti-war conservative at 19, 20 years old. I was that all the way up until about 2007, 2008. I was still that. This is during the Bush era. I was on talk radio in a part-time capacity, later a full-time capacity. I was being a pundit, and I quit calling myself a conservative because I would say during that era, oh yeah, I'm a conservative. They're like, hell yeah, Dick Cheney. I'm like, no, you wrong on that front. I'm a Pat Buchanan guy from like 10 years ago. I'm that, not this. But that was so pervasive that's what it meant to be that at the time. So I'm sitting around hopeless as hell, glad to even have a job in talk radio, saying I'm on the right in this environment, because the callers would be like, you're a liberal, you're against McCain, you're against the war, you're against the Patriot Act, you're a liberal. That's what I heard time and time and time again. So this guy runs for president named Ron Paul. This is 2008. Now, I knew who he was, and I go, man, me and the 5 people that vote for him, cool, that'll be great. Nobody's going to pay attention to this guy. I like him. He's cool. I'm not a libertarian yet. He is. I respect him. We're anti-war. That's always been my primary issue. So, at the age I was at the time, which was in my early to mid-30s, I see the oldest guy in the race who's no great orator. His ideas are great, but, no great speaker in any sense, get not only the biggest crowds of anybody, including the eventual nominee, John McCain, but the youngest crowds of anybody. The oldest guy in the race has the youngest audience. I was like, holy hell, what is going on here? I've just spent the last 8 years, everybody calling me a liberal because I'm not pro-war, and really, if you analyze it, some of what Eric just said, the most conservative guy in this race, if you break it down in terms of what traditional American conservatism is Ron Paul. That's the message later in 2012 when the campaign hired me that I was hired to put out there. Like, I know y'all think Mitt Romney's like this great conservative, but let's talk about this a little bit. The point being, from that time, obviously the Free State Project, what you've been doing here in Portfest, all preceded that time. From that time till about 2012 was the Ron Paul Liberty Movement. Is it fair to say that most people in this room were part of that in some way or respect it? Yes, okay. It's the biggest explosion of libertarian thought and ideas and politics, if you want to go that far, in American history. You'd have to go back to the Revolution or something like that, but certainly modern American history. I think in one of my speeches I researched how much Ayn Rand's books had sold. You're welcome to the dog. How much Ayn Rand's books had sold when they came out, different times. It was that period from 2008 to 2012, it was like quadruple the amount that they had sold in times prior. So just one little anecdote about how popular libertarianism had got. So we're here in 2024 today, and whether you're in the Libertarian Party or you're in the Republican Party, whether you are a Trump lover or a Trump hater or you think Joe Biden's great, I don't know, we won't go that far, but you can have conversations today about subjects like war and peace that were impossible to have before Ron Paul ran for president. Now, I mostly work with liberty-leaning Republican candidates. I worked with Rand Paul. Obviously, I just mentioned I worked with Ron Paul's campaign. But in 2008, when, I'm trying to think of the candidates that were running that cycle, Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum, who's the guy that was in Hunt for Red October that's dead? Fred Thompson. They would say to Ron Paul when he's like, there are reasons that 9/11 happened, Rudy Giuliani. Would you like to hear them? There's this term called blowback that the CIA invented. I didn't invent it. They did. And here's what it means. That those other candidates would say, well, here comes Ron Paul with blaming America first. He's blaming America for what happened to us on that day. And Ron's like, no. That stuff kind of worked. In the 2008 election cycle, people like that, the neoconservative dominated Republican Party could look at Ron Paul and say, that guy hates America, he's against America, and for enough of the Republican electorate, that worked. By the time we got to 2012, or post-Tea Party that started about 2009, 2010, they tried it again. The same neoconservative people, Mitt Romney, I would include in that, who was the eventual nominee and got his butt kicked. Ron Paul is against America. He blames America first. His foreign policy is liberal. Well, that wasn't working as much because at that point you had Sarah Palin who had sort of left the McCain camp and said, maybe Iraq wasn't such a great idea. She wouldn't have said that when she was with McCain. You had all these different things happening, and you had years of this sort of Tea Party thing where the main definer of what it meant to be a Republican or a conservative was no longer just support for the Iraq War and Bush-Cheney, but maybe we spent too much during that time. And what did we spend it on? Man, Iraq cost that much? Why are we still in Afghanistan? Questions began to arise. Ron Paul was a big part of that. By the time you get to Trump in 2016, and just to be clear, I've never voted for Trump. I am neutral on the issue. It's not somebody I absolutely hate or absolutely love. Don't have that TDS bug. I know that sounds crazy, but I just don't. But if we're going to talk about positive things, we live in a political environment right now when we're funneling billions and billions to Ukraine. If somebody has a problem with that, they're probably a Republican voter, and they might have voted for Trump. That was the Ron Paul message in an earlier cycle that was called liberal by the same people who were now supporting Donald Trump. One of the reasons I've actually thought about voting for him in this cycle is I'm sort of torn up by what's happening in the Middle East right now. When Joe Biden is asked, well, what do you think about the civilian killings in Gaza? He's like, we're going to support Israel and they can do what they want. And then later whatever. RFK Jr., who I kind of liked up until that point, kind of gave the same answer as Joe Biden. Donald Trump said the killing should stop, and it wouldn't have happened if I was in there. Now, is that true? I don't know. He says all kinds of stuff. But is that the most rational or humane answer. That's something that Ron Paul would have said. That's certainly something his son would have said, that maybe we should use diplomacy instead of war. Jaw, or what is it? Jaw's better than war. Was that Churchill? We're at a point in our politics right now, and I'm just talking about foreign policy at the moment, where you can talk and speak about things related to war and peace as an American, and what our military does abroad, and the constant interventionism, in a way that you couldn't speak about it before. And the liberty movement was a big part of moving that window to where it is today. If you look at issues, I'm just going to switch here a little bit, something like the Federal Reserve. I was listening to Tom Wood's podcast recently. He had on Thomas Massey, and Massey had mentioned how much things had moved on this issue. He goes, Ron Paul had his end the Fed, not audit the Fed, which is good too, but the end the Fed, the radical one, legislation. It was like, me and him would vote on it. Maybe Walter Jones was there at the time or something like that. Massey reintroduced it. He was telling this to Tom Woods. He goes, I had like 24 people willing to back me up on this. That was an issue in 2008 that people at the time, I think Tom Woods was one of them, they're like, Ron Paul probably shouldn't be talking about this. It's above people's heads. It's too bookwormy. And it was part of the reason all those young people flocked to those rallies. It is something that we talk about in mainstream American politics now. Oh, if inflation's high. Why? Oh, MSNBC said because Putin's making it high. But Rand Paul says it's because we spent too much money. Thomas Massey says it's because we spent too much money and we've devalued the dollar. Oh, well, that makes sense. This is a conversation that is in the mainstream of American politics right now. And don't think that the libertarian movement, the liberty movement, I like to call it, didn't have a lot to do with that. Civil liberties, a big thing when I was pre-Ron Paul and certainly doing that. If you were against the Patriot Act, you were a bad person. You're not even a Patriot Act. Well, post-COVID and people getting their businesses closed down and telling businesses what they can do and telling individuals what they must do to keep a job and mandatory vaccinations. On top of preceding that, the Department of Homeland Security putting Tea Partiers on government lists and saying, we have to watch your activity. You want less spending and less government? You must be a terrorist. A decade of that and then some by people on the right, people who used to be for the Patriot Act, whatnot, have sort of changed their mind about personal autonomy and civil liberties in a way that they weren't supposed to be there before. Now, these events happen, but the liberty movement existing and marshaling these arguments and these ideas in the right direction was a big help. I'm naming all these things because sometimes we don't see all the good that we've done as individuals, our leadership, all that. I don't care if it's the Republican Party with the Paul family, Thomas Massey, adjacent people like Mike Lee. I would put Cynthia Loomis on that list. The Libertarian Party and many of the wonderful people there. All around making these arguments, putting it out into the ether as we've done since y'all have been doing it for 2 decades. We could start with the Ron Paul movement. It has all mattered. I'll add one thing to that, and you and I were talking about this a second ago. When I started within the Ron Paul movement, unofficially in 2008, officially in 2012, one of the things I strove to do, this is kind of I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm going to continue to explain it. People would show up at Ron Paul events wanting to ask me or him or somebody about the Bilderbergers. I'm like, that's not what we're here for, dude. Like, we're going to talk about ending the Fed and war's bad. And sort of conspiracy theory kind of stuff. And I spent a lot of time in my writing on it. I'm like, we're trying to say that libertarianism is serious as a governing philosophy, and Ron Paul represents that. Don't mix it up with all this other crap. Don't do that. Well, I've completely changed my tune. Not that I think the Bilderbergers are a big thing, and I don't want some jerk chasing me with a camera again and going, Jack Hunter, are you working for the Bilderbergers? I'm like, I like cheeseburgers. I can build them any way I want. Just leave me alone with this stuff. We reached a point in American politics where everybody is a conspiracy theorist. The mainstream of the Democratic Party, I'm talking about Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, to this day, even after an exhaustive 2-year investigation by Robert Mueller on whether Donald Trump was in cahoots with Putin to win the 2016 election and totally disproved it, Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, almost every Democrat you meet has some version of it in them that's true to this day. Why am I going to rag on Alex Jones if I'm not going to rag on them? So I'm just not going to rag on anybody. They are Alex Jones, as far as I'm concerned. Y'all might have differing opinions about Alex Jones, but I think you know what I'm getting at. There are Republican versions of that. There are certainly many libertarian versions of that. But we've reached a point in our politics where everybody believes some big, crazy thing that is just not true, coupled with things that were conspiracy theories, according to official narratives, become true. You can't say that the COVID thing originated in a Wuhan lab in China. That's not true. Big thing in the Washington Post. Where did this conspiracy theory come from? A year and a half later, how did we not know that this was true and we admit it's true now? But you see what I'm saying? There's just enough versions of that we're just on a different playing field. They can't push you to the side and say that guy's crazy in a way they used to because he might not be because he thought it came from a lab or some other thing. And also everybody's crazy. The entire Democratic and Republican parties are crazy. They believe some big weird thing. I just think we're in a different playing field now, and I'm very optimistic about what we can accomplish. Look, I was on that trajectory where Ron Paul ran for president. I didn't think he was going to win, but we were going to fight like hell. Ron Paul ran for president again. I didn't think he was going to win, but we were going to fight like hell. Rand Paul ran for president. I thought he was going to win, and Donald Trump bulldozed everybody, so that plan didn't work out. But what we've accomplished throughout, I think, is important. I've mentioned just a couple issue examples right here, and I think the things can even get better. I'm kind of interested in a lot of what the Libertarian Party is doing right now. I'm interested in the libertarian-leaning Republicans and what they're doing. Rand Paul certainly at the top of that. Is he grilling Fauci today, or is just harassing other people about lying to us about COVID? But that's happening right now. But all that's important. The mainstream media is not going to report on that. He could find every truth and upend everything in the world. It's going to be people like us talking about it. So I'm going to open up this for questions, if that semblance of words made any sort of sense whatsoever that you might have for me or any of the stuff I'm talking about.
Since others are shy, I'll get us going. So you talked a lot about what the Liberty Movement has accomplished in terms of expanding the narratives, the what Tom Woods would call the 3x5 card of allowable public opinion, right? Suddenly some of our ideas are on that card, as much as the mainstream media doesn't like it. But you've also talked about things on the national level, but what about on the state levels? What do you see as far as kind of progress in, obviously, like in New Hampshire, we're very proud of what's being built here. But what do you see like happening in the state legislatures across the country where certainly it seems like there's a lot of maybe more victories there than certainly in Washington.
And I can't keep up with them. There's so many of them. One of my jobs that I had with Young Americans for Liberty for a couple of years at their conference was to do these panels with state legislators that were Young Americans for Liberty was behind. And there'd be 4 people who'd done wonderful things that I'd never heard of. You know, whether it's gun rights or, you know, different property issues and whatnot. The Free State Project's got to be one of the biggest state initiatives ever for the Liberty Movement, right? I mean, what y'all are doing is wonderful, 100%. But I encounter that every day. A couple years back, Tom Davis, there's no reason y'all should know who that is, in my home state of South Carolina. He's a state representative. There was a little girl whose name I can't remember. I'm embarrassed, but she had to travel to Colorado to get medicine for her epilepsy. And he changed that. Now she can stay home in South Carolina and get the medicine, but I think that's a libertarian thing. It was an illegal thing at the time. There's just so many examples of it. Lots of gun stuff. Where's Becker? What the hell's his name? Is it Rick Becker? Is he running for House? Yeah. Right. Which I was in, and I still can't remember if it was South or North Dakota. But go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. My 2 questions. One is, what's your thoughts on Chase Oliver?
Okay.
And my next question would be, you mentioned CNN, MSNBC, and all the rest, corporate media.
Right.
How do we combat that? Because they are dying.
Yes, they are.
But my 90-year-old mother watches it religiously, and I think probably everybody over the age of 60 still goes there. And how do you get to that older crowd and make them understand that they're being lied to on a daily basis?
That's a great question. There's 2 questions. The first one about Chase. I've never met Chase. I'm a big professional wrestling fan, as is he, and that's been pointed out to me many times since he won the nomination. So maybe we'll need to go to some matches somewhere. As I said, I'm a big anti-war person. That goes a long way with me. I understand some people being uncomfortable with how he approached COVID and other things, and I would agree with those people. But I'm not here to bash anybody or anything. He's going to do his thing, and it is what it is. I don't know who I'm voting for this year. You do your second question. So, older audiences or just the state of establishment, legacy media, however you want to call it. People know that these SOBs are lying. They know it, even if they watch it all the time. My mom is in her 70s. She watches Fox a good bit. And look, Tucker Carlson's one of the best independent voices out there, and he was the best thing on Fox when he was there. Jesse Waters is pretty good. Laura Ingraham says some cool things. She can be anti-war on occasion. But in general, it's a mouthpiece for the official party, Republican Party for them. MSNBC and CNN speak for the Democrats. They are not journalists in the sense that, oh, there's a story out there, we should be on top of them, we should inform the public. No, they get mad at people that do that, which is what independent journalists do now. And while they're growing, I work at Base Politics with Hannah Cox and Brad Palumbo. That's what we do. I think Joe Rogan is one of the most important independent journalists out there. And what does he do? He's just a smart dude who's intellectually curious, and people like to listen to his show because there's a lot of smart people out there who are also intellectually curious. That's it. There's no agenda. This fly might have an agenda, but that's what people do. I don't know how you get people set in their ways about watching a particular network to stop doing that. I don't know that it's that important. Maybe that sounds rude to say that. My mom, who watches Fox, she'd probably be embarrassed I was talking about her like this, but she's not here. She'll never see this. Do you remember when Trump did the First Step Act? Do you remember the woman Alice Johnson, sort of a middle-aged black woman who had been in prison for, 17 years because her boyfriend was a drug dealer? Stupid. She should have never been in prison. Well, she wasn't actually part of the First Step Act, and the First Step Act was getting nonviolent criminals out of jail and in sort of halfway houses so they could get on with their lives. It was the biggest piece of criminal justice reform legislation passed ever, at least in the last 100 years. So I was talking with Mom, we're watching Fox, and she sees Alice Johnson on TV who's singing the praises of the First Step Act, singing the praises of Trump who got her out of jail. And she's like, why in the hell was this woman who's like dating a guy who got caught with drugs in jail? I go, well, they twisted the law to make her an accomplice or whatever. She goes, that's not right. I said, exactly. So, this relative of mine who'd probably never thought about the criminal justice system and how unfair it is because it never touched her in that way, was now thinking about this because of what was on the thing she liked to watch. Now, don't think that the existence of Rand Paul and Mike Lee when the First Step Act happened weren't a factor in that. Sure, Jared Kushner was, sure, a Kardashian was, but don't think that these libertarian-leaning Republicans had not talked to the president about that and pushed him in a certain direction. That matters, right? And that's the liberty movement writ large. There's another example of that. I actually wrote a piece for the American Conservative about this. Do y'all remember in 2017 when we were on the brink, or Trump was on the brink of bombing Iran? So I think Bolton was still there and all the people around him. We're pushing him to do this. I know that my former boss, Senator Paul, had spoken to him about never do anything like this. You ran saying you wouldn't do an Iraq war, which is what this would be. But the story I heard from sources I trust is that Trump stopped listening to his staff. This is while it was going on, and called Tucker Carlson. I was like, what should I do? And he basically said what Rand said, like, you ran saying you weren't going to be like Bush, you don't want another Iraq, would be that. That coupled with he asked an advisor, what would the civilian casualties be? He's like, that's too much. He's changed his mind. That matters. That small thing that happened. So even Fox News and MSNBC is just, oh God. There's things to play with there, like I did with my mother, if that helps at all. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I've been droning on for too long.
No, it's okay. So you talk about being anti-war, and a lot of people in that crowd would say that America's an empire because of all the external things that we're doing, all these military bases, and a lot of people think that this started recently. But if you look into the history of America, from my perspective, the American Republic died with the Civil War because
Okay.
you have the Reconstruction era, and then in 1898, the U.S.-Spanish War. That's when we started making ourselves, going from being isolationist and keeping the world in check to building this empire. And then World War II happens, and instead of Britain being the global empire America now is, and now that empire is crumbling apart. Do you agree with that perspective? Do you still think America is a republic, and can that republic be saved?
I would answer that in two ways. So we should be a republic. We have certainly exceeded our constitutional boundaries. That's no secret to anybody in this room. But it's still a good thing to point to and say this is how we should be. We have to have some sort of rule of law. Sorry to any of the anarchists in here who would disagree with that. But the Constitution is what we should point to. As far as when we became an empire or stopped being a republic and all that kind of stuff, I always try to start at any messaging, whether I'm writing under my own name or helping somebody else with something else, start where people are and work backwards. So what are we involved in right now? We're funneling billions to Ukraine to fuel a U.S. proxy war with Russia. First of all, frame it that way, because that's what's going on. And we're just kind of letting Israel do whatever they want. They had every right to retaliate after October 7th. That was terrible, that terrorist attack. But maybe it's gone a little too far, and it's okay to say that too, and maybe we shouldn't be paying for it. So that's two things that people could wrap their head around more than whether we're an empire or not. Not that that conversation is not important. We will have them for over the next few days at this conference, I'm sure. But if I'm talking to a relative or just a man on the street, that's where I would start. And you'll look at the polling and whatnot. You'll see a lot of sentiment, especially on Ukraine now, because we've spent so much money, like, to what end? Why? Are we making things worse for ourselves with another great power like Russia? Are we making things worse for ourselves with inflation sky high and the debt being what it is, and we're giving them money? I think that's things people can wrap their head around, but they do go to your question about what are we doing? Are we a republic or an empire? A republic wouldn't be sending all that money. We wouldn't have it to begin with. We don't have it to begin with. Does anybody else have questions?
Let's see, 1988, and Bush 41 won with the slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." And of course, then we go into a recession. The real estate industry in New Hampshire was thrown upside down terribly. And in 92, Bush 41 failed to campaign in New Hampshire. So Pat Buchanan got 40% of the primary vote to Bush's 36% because we were pissed off.
Yeah.
But my question is, what's it going to take to get you to move to New Hampshire?
To get me to move to New Hampshire? I live in two places right now, one terrible and one great. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, but I spent half my time in Old Town Alexandria, which is basically the D.C. area, just for work. New Hampshire's a great state. I lived in Woburn in the 90s in Massachusetts. My band practiced in Methuen. Funny story. See these clunky cowboy boots I'm wearing? Well, when I moved to Woburn when I was 19, because of my accent, I worked in a warehouse and was a delivery driver. South Boston guy, country boy, because of my accent. So I was like, all right, you son of a bitch. And I went and bought cowboy boots, and I've worn them ever since. But that's why I did it, just to stick it in his face. I think New Hampshire's a wonderful state. Let me ask you this. When I was here in the 90s, you know, it was the more libertarian state, whatever. But people I know, one of my best friends is from Boston, Jim. They said that so many people from Mass have moved here that it's not as good as it was in the 90s. Is that true? Okay, y'all would know better than anybody. I'm asking. Okay.
You know,
I didn't know if the mass holes had messed it up for everybody is what I'm asking.
Well, the Free State Project is countering the mass holes, right?
There you go.
know, we're bringing in the freedom lovers so that any mass holes that move up, we're going to outnumber them, right?
Check
Well,
them.
you know, hey, unless you are a Massachusetts person who supports Elizabeth Warren for U.S. Senate, I don't count you a masshole. All right. You're just a mass good guy, you know? All right. Well, all right. I won't take your identity away from you. If you want to identify as a masshole, you can have it. Jack, I had a few questions for you.
Sure.
And again, I'm trying to defer to others who haven't asked questions, but So two things that came up. You mentioned some of the media personalities who are very big today. So Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Well, my question is, what do you make of the fact? What's worth taking away from the fact that both of them in the 2008 Ron Paul campaign, when he was a very marginal, or they tried to at least everyone tried to marginalize him, right? They were both supporters of Dr. Paul. You know, Tucker Carlson speaking at the Rally for the Republic.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan being on, I don't know, what some late night show.
He was doing Fear Factor and all that.
Yeah. But now they're the two biggest voices in alternative media. What lessons should we draw from that?
Well, I think that's another thing I'm optimistic about. Who brought up MSNBC and Fox? There you go. More people listen to Joe Rogan. He's the biggest one. There's sort of this zeitgeist of, I would include Joe Rogan, certainly Glenn Greenwald, who's been a hero of mine for a long time, and I've gotten to meet once or twice. Bill Maher, who can be wrong, but also can be very right when preaching to the left about, hey, aren't we for free speech anymore? I think comedians like Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, are part of this thing. I don't want to be all right-left, but the left in recent years, people call it woke, has sort of ditched liberalism. We're classical liberals. We believe in free speech. Well, the progressive left, at least we have that in common, what the ACLU used to be. I think Naomi Wolf's going to be here later this week. Talk to her about it. She'll tell you the same thing. Part of being a leftist in the American tradition forever was free speech. We're going to defend Nazis, says the ACLU in 1978 in Skokie, Illinois. Not because we're Nazis, obviously we're not, but that's how far we're willing to go to protect free speech. Well, it's not like that anymore. We live in an age where Matt Taibbi and others report on the Twitter files, which showed, and they have extensive evidence, that the federal government of Joe Biden and other people asked these social media platforms to censor or manipulate the news. And that's not the biggest story in the world right now, according to CNN or New York Times. That's authoritarian. You know, they say, oh, if you elect Trump, he's going to be authoritarian. He might. Biden's being an authoritarian right now, but they don't care when Biden's doing it. That's exactly right. Throwing your opponent off state ballots? Could you imagine if Trump was like, kick Biden off? Like, they would raise holy hell. It'd be the top story on CNN every second. I don't think people believe that anymore. To your question, Joe Rogan, Bill Maher, Glenn Greenwald, I think comedians like Shane Gillis, Dave Chappelle did a big thing when he did that special on Netflix, The Closer, all the trans stuff. I don't want to get into that. But the point is, he's a comedian. He was saying funny things, and a big part of the left was like, you can't say those things. You can't say those things in 2020 or whatever it was in America. Netflix, fire him, take this special down. Didn't happen. I think that was the beginning of things going in the other direction, where people are like, you mean I can speak my mind? And it's not about hate. It's about giving your opinion. And sometimes it might contrast in a negative way with somebody else's opinion. It's called America and free speech. I think those voices, Dave Chappelle being a big one, he was the one that stood up there and was like, I'm too big to cancel me. Come bring it. And they couldn't do it. I think that's where you see lots of other people talking about issues that might not have 5 or 6 years ago. Famous people and regular everyday people like us, everybody. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a healthy thing. Some of the Palestinian protests right now, a lot of those people were wanting to cancel people for saying the wrong things. I think they're getting a little bit of their own medicine right now, and I don't say that gladly, but I'd rather them learn some lessons from how they used to act than to continue to act that way. So, any more questions? Did any of that make sense? Sometimes I think I make no sense. I think that's absolutely wonderful, yes. But go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, since you worked for both Ron Paul and Rand Paul, I was wondering if you could elaborate on their differences in their philosophy and how their principles. They're not exactly 100% aligned, so could you elaborate on that?
So I learned very early when I worked on Rand with the book not to ask that question. And this is not making fun of your question at all, but I learned this like quickly. So, God, that was a weird time. It was fun. It was great. It was wonderful. I would sit in this crappy campaign van we had with a tape recorder and be talking to Rand like, all right, blah, stuff for the book. And then the next day I'd be typing away in my hotel room for 12 hours. But during that time, in the beginning, I was like, was this like your dad? And he would just look at me, and this happened with Ron one time too. Like, basically, the look told me to shut up, don't ask such a stupid question. They're their own men, is the best way to answer that. Like, and I don't even know if they talk, I don't think if they're at the dinner table, it's like, Dad, I know you want to end the Fed today, should we wait a week? Like, I don't think those conversations ever happen. They just do what they do. I can't think of where they really differ philosophically, maybe in their messaging and application. Please stand up and tell me if you can think of something where they significantly differ. I can tell you Rand is a little more pragmatic, and that's okay. And part of that is being a senator instead of a member of the House. That is a very different beast. There's only so much you can do. But I think he's done about as much as you possibly could as a libertarian who's a Republican in that capacity. But go ahead.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that Ron Paul absolutely defended the legalization of all drugs, including heroin, and Rand Paul suggested legalize marijuana, but not other drugs, not hard drugs.
That's
So
a
it's
legitimate difference.
Yeah.
But that would go to what I was saying about being pragmatic. Do you think it's easier to reschedule marijuana by saying, let's legalize marijuana or reschedule it and heroin, or just sticking with marijuana? Fair question. I like that there are figures out there who say legalize it all. That's important. You need those figures. You also need, maybe if there's a senator, to be like, maybe we should do something different with marijuana. So it's a pragmatic thing. I'll give you another example of that happening. When Rand Paul first got in office in 2010, he was like, end all foreign aid. I agree with that. About a year later, it's end all foreign aid except Israel based on some conditions, which we don't even do anymore at all. But it was easier to argue against ending all the other foreign aid by doing that. Do you get mad at him for doing that? You can. What's going to get us closer to getting rid of some foreign aid? Probably that. If you see what I'm saying, they're coming from the same place, but have different ways of applying themselves and messaging, basically. And I'm not mad at it. It is what it is. So y'all can be mad at it. We can have different opinions, what I was saying earlier, free speech. Any more questions? You probably know more about it than I do. I have friends that are part of that. I think it's absolutely wonderful what's being done with that. I think more people know about it. I've seen, to your question, I've seen it talked about on Fox News. That's good for the people who won't watch anything else but that. So that's a better question for me, messaging. I learned about Defend the Guard after the fact. Good. And hopefully more people are learning about it. I do think it's penetrating, if that's your main question. Yeah, and that's what you want. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, a question about how much leverage we actually have. I was also probably thinking of, Trump's recent appearance at the Libertarian Convention, where he said he's going to appoint libertarians, whatever that means, and, he said he was going to free Ross. A, do you think he's sincere, or is he just saying what things he wanted to hear? And, do you think that our voting cohort, however million to million, however big it is, do you think that we really are we have enough power that we're the leverage right now, that if we all sort of moved in one direction, that we could flip seats, or do you think are we still kind of diffuse and we're having influence here and there where we can?
So good luck getting libertarians to all go in one direction, but very good question as well. I do think we have leverage. I don't think it matters if everybody at this conference goes in different directions to still have leverage. That's okay. I made a joke about us being libertarians, herding cats, however you want to put it. Ron Paul had 1 million people vote for him in the 2008 primaries and 2 million in 2012. He doubled it. Are all those people at Pork Fest? We'd love them to be at Pork Fest, but they're probably not, but they're still there, and they voted for that dude one time. Could that be the difference maker for somebody like Trump appearing at the Libertarian Party convention in some places and states? Maybe. The math's there. As far as what the Libertarian Party is doing, and y'all can throw tomatoes at me or whatever you want to do, I'm just going to give my honest opinion. That's why I came here. I voted for Joe Jorgensen. I voted for Gary Johnson. They are all right. It's a vote of conscience. I work with Republicans who are liberty-leaning most of the time in what I do for work. That's where my focus is, but I like that the Libertarian Party is there. It has not been more interesting to me than it is right now in my lifetime of thinking about this stuff. So you have a Libertarian Party who elects candidates, a presidential candidate, Chase Oliver is this cycle, and they run, and we see if we can get more than we got before. Cool, nothing wrong with that. Should be proud of that. But could a third party like the Libertarian Party also be a party that affects one of the major parties? I've always said that. I'm like, if y'all run somebody against Thomas Massey, that's stupid. So could this be a version of that? It's funny, the people who were really mad that Trump was at the Libertarian Convention, they're like, oh, he said he's going to execute drug dealers. That's your guy? Well, no. But they're absolutely convinced that on no way, shape, or form he would commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht, but he's definitely going to execute drug dealers. I'm like, what's more likely to happen in that scenario? I think it's smart to say, all right, Trump, you're not a libertarian. You're Trump. Can you believe what he says is what you ask me. I don't know. He's Trump. I mean, it's about his ego, right? I don't think he's like this great, good person, but he can be a force for good. I'm glad we didn't bomb Iran. And, you know, if it takes, well, these people like me, I can win in certain areas and I got to commute the sentence of this guy, I'll do that. And if he did, I think there's more of a chance in the second term. I'm thinking about Julian Assange. I'm thinking about the First Step Act being a Second Step Act, a Third Step Act. When Trump went to, I don't know if y'all paid attention, he was in Detroit last weekend, and a man came up, I think he was in a wheelchair, it was a middle-aged black man, and he's like, I'm not in jail anymore because of the First Step Act, and I got put in jail because of the 1994 crime bill of which Biden spearheaded. Okay, do we be like, I hate Trump, I don't want to hear about this guy or further criminal justice reform as a libertarian, or do we be like, is this something to work with here as libertarians? I think you'd be a fool to say no. I don't care how you feel about Trump. Get that crap out of your head. What are we here for? Do we care about criminal justice reform? Do we care about non-interventionism? Do we care about rescheduling marijuana or making it legal or however you want to put it? All these things, how can we get there? If it's working with one of the major parties, I think we'd be fools not to do it. And I admire what the Libertarian Party is doing right now towards that end. I'd say the same thing if they were making headway with Joe Biden, but good luck with that.
So I know that the major topic of this has been the liberty movement in 2024 and the progress that's been made. But I'd also be interested to hear your perspective on the state of the neoconservative movement in 2024 versus where things were in 2008 and 2012.
Boy, did you give me a last good thing to talk about. So when I was the Pat Buchanan guy at 19, I hated the neocons. I still hate the neocons, but it's just like my lifelong dream would be to kick them back to the Democratic Party. You know, it's never going to happen. It's Bush and like everything's just neoconservatism. David Frum's kicking anybody who's anti-war, including Ron Paul, out of, you know, off the right in National Review with his Unpatriotic Conservatives essay. Those people are down for the count. They have institutional power. They will continue to have institutional power, which means money and influence and whatnot. But most of them have gone to the Democratic Party. You've got a few savvy guys like Lindsey Graham who have navigated the Trump era, but they're still neocons through and through. You've got Nikki Haley, who was the neocons cheerleaded in this election, who has no constituency. I'm from South Carolina, where she was governor. Trump would have kicked her ass if she stayed in the race. They're down for the count. They don't have the base. Political movements need a base. I don't care if you're the Libertarian Party or the Republican Party. You have to have people who are out there who vote, who somewhat agree with you, who kind of generally support what you're doing. The neoconservatives had a base in the Bush era. They lost a little bit of grip in the Obama era, and post-Ron Paul, certainly Trump, it's a different party. I'm not saying it's all good. There's a lot of things I don't like about it. I didn't vote for Trump. I might this time for reasons I've explained up here. But the neocons, you can see it in their desperation. What am I talking about? The neoconservatives are the talk hosts on MSNBC. Their number one show is Nicole Wallace, who was the comms person for Bush. So like they're saying the same things they always have. Oh, if you're against sending money to Ukraine, you're with Putin. You know, you love Putin. And, oh, you're an anti-Semite if you have a problem with the stuff that's going on in Gaza. It doesn't ring true anymore. It's certainly not with the base that they once held. And so my dream as a Buchananite 19 who was anti-war, just kicking the crap out of those guys and sending them somewhere else, kind of happened. So can't get mad at that. If there's any more questions, I'll take one. We're getting close to the time. Hating on neocons is a good way to end any speech. So I really appreciate being with y'all here today. This was my first Port Fest, believe it or not. It has been absolutely wonderful. Thank y'all.